So the next policy area with proposed changes included in the Better Housing Amendment is secondary dwellings. So secondary dwellings are smaller dwellings that can be built on a lot in conjunction with another dwelling on that same lot. So the example being the sort of traditional granny flat style of development. They can be attached to other dwellings or also can be obviously freestanding. Key issues from community feedback and officer investigations have focused on concerns about the quality, scale, and intensity of our secondary dwelling development happening in the region. And our review has confirmed that there is a lack of clarity about what exactly is a secondary dwelling and how they should operate. Our reviews also confirm that overdevelopment and associated undesirable development outcomes are occurring, including things like cars being parked on frontages and verges, and increased numbers on neighbourhood streets, increased density and changed neighbourhood character, reduced open space and landscaping, and privacy impacts where those secondary dwellings are located close to boundaries. We've also found that there are adverse privacy and amenity impacts to immediate neighbours, which are being caused by the siting design of those freestanding secondary dwellings. And also observed some undesirable car parking outcomes, which are impacting the character and the residential amenity of our neighbourhoods. In response to the sort of key issues and impacts and the feedback we've been receiving, there are a number of specific policy directions that have been developed for secondary dwellings, which they're forming the basis of our detailed proposed changes. So these include improving how a secondary dwelling operates, so making the differences between a secondary dwelling and dual occupancy very clear, that they are not one and the same. Resolving small lot overdevelopment, so limiting development to large lots that are capable of accommodating both the primary and secondary dwelling and the services, and improving streetscapes and managing our privacy and amenity concerns. So better design, siting, and orientation to avoid the impacts on the neighbours, and also maintaining that shared open space and parking. An important clarification is to make at this point is that the policy changes relating to secondary dwellings that are proposed in the Better Housing Amendment apply to our general residential zones. So the urban neighbourhood precinct, the next generation neighbourhood precinct, suburban neighbourhood precinct, and our coastal communities precinct, and also apply in the emerging community zones transition precinct for developed lots. However, the proposed changes do not apply to secondary dwellings being proposed in the rural and rural residential zones. So there's been a number of questions around that. So our changes do not apply in those particular zones. So I'm now just going to take you through some of the key proposed changes relating to secondary dwellings and the intent behind those changes. So firstly, the proposed amendment improves how a secondary dwelling operates by changing the planning scheme definition to the new state legislated definition, which encourages them to be rented to anyone, requiring shared services for water, wastewater, electricity, and the like, and ensuring all on-site occupants can easily access open space and parking. The amendment also seeks to better manage overdevelopment impacts. Does this by proposing minimum lot sizes for a secondary dwelling of 450 square metres in the next generation neighbourhood precinct, and 600 square metres in our suburban neighbourhood precinct. So below these lot sizes, a secondary dwelling would not be encouraged. The proposed amendment also manages scale and intensity by maintaining the existing secondary dwelling gross floor area limits or GFA limits, but making changes to those limits to link them to lot size. The GFA for a secondary dwelling is proposed to be, or sort of gross floor area for a secondary dwelling is proposed to be 45 square metres on lots between 450 square metres and 800 square metres, and 55 square metres on lots that are greater than 800 square metres. And again, importantly, this does not relate to secondary dwellings being proposed in our rural and rural residential areas. The amendment also proposes changes to improve amenity and privacy outcomes. So it does this by orientating any secondary dwellings entry, patio, balcony, or deck inwardly and not towards the boundary, and retaining existing 10-metre separation distance requirements between the primary and secondary dwelling. Finally, the proposed changes seek to improve local streetscapes by increasing parking for dwelling houses in the next generation neighbourhood precinct from 1 space to 2, keeping the additional 1 car parking space requirement for a secondary dwelling. On-site open space and parking is also intended to be accessible to all occupants of both the primary and secondary dwelling. So including some proposed clarifications around that. Questions on secondary dwellings. We've had a question come through from one of our registered attendees today. So what are the new rules surrounding secondary dwellings, and what's council's attitude towards secondary dwellings in the current environment? So we've talked a bit about the new rules through those previous slides, but the amendment does propose to improve our planning policy regarding secondary dwellings in order to support those improved development outcomes. So as covered in the previous slide, that's things like new minimum lot sizes for a secondary dwelling, linking our maximum GFA requirements to lot size, and for standalone secondary dwellings in our established neighbourhoods, ensuring that the primary entry, patios, balconies and decks all face inwardly. Council certainly remains supportive of secondary dwelling development as a means of maintaining choice and diversity in housing, and as a means of achieving or contributing to our long-term growth management goals. But through the amendment, we are seeking to ensure that form of development doesn't occur at the expense of appropriate amenity and character outcomes with our region's residential neighbourhoods. And so again, directly responding to community feedback around those matters.